My daughter passed away 2 years ago. Every night, my son-in-law would enter her old room and lock the door. I thought it was grief, until I installed a camera. What I saw that night shattered me. Within 10 minutes, the house was full of police officers. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Frank, and I'm 59 years old. 2 years ago, I lost the most precious thing in my life, my daughter Emilia. She was only 32 when cancer took her away from us. Since then, I've been living with my son-in-law Benjamin in the house that once echoed with her laughter. I thought we were both grieving together, supporting each other through the darkest period of our lives. I was wrong about everything. The first time I noticed Benjamin's strange behavior was about 6 months after Emilia's funeral. I'm an early riser, always have been, but I started waking up around 2 or 3 in the morning to use the bathroom. That's when I heard it. The soft click of Emilia's bedroom door closing, followed by the distinct sound of the lock turning. At first, I didn't think much of it. Grief affects people differently, I told myself. Maybe Benjamin found comfort in being surrounded by her things, her scent, her memories. God knows I understood that pain. There were nights when I'd stand outside her door, my hand hovering over the doorknob, wanting to go in but never finding the courage. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every single night, without fail, Benjamin would slip into that room around 2:30 in the morning and lock himself inside for exactly 2 hours. I started timing it, though I couldn't explain why. The precision of it bothered me. Grief isn't that organized, that's scheduled. One particularly restless night, I decided to check on him. Maybe we could talk, share our pain, help each other heal. I walked quietly down the hallway and stood outside Emilia's door. What I heard made my blood run cold. Benjamin was talking to someone. His voice was low, intimate, almost seductive. I pressed my ear against the door, my heart pounding so loud I was afraid he might hear it. He was definitely speaking to another person, but I couldn't make out the words clearly. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop, a woman's laugh. Soft, flirtatious, definitely not coming from any recording or video. I stumbled back to my room, my mind racing. Was Benjamin bringing women into Emilia's sacred space? The thought was so horrific, so unthinkable, that I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe he was watching old videos of Emilia, or talking to her pictures. People do strange things when they're grieving. But deep down, I knew what I had heard. The way he spoke wasn't the voice of a man talking to memories. It was the voice of a man very much engaged with someone alive, someone present. The next morning, Benjamin acted completely normal. He made coffee, asked about my plans for the day, mentioned how much he missed Emilia. His performance was flawless, but now I was watching him differently. I noticed things I had missed before, how he never seemed genuinely sad anymore, how quickly he changed the subject whenever I brought up Emilia's memory, how he'd started paying more attention to his appearance lately. I spent the following days in a state of constant anxiety. Every interaction with Benjamin felt loaded with hidden meaning. When he hugged me goodbye before work, all I could think about was whether those same hands had been touching another woman in my daughter's bed. When he talked about honoring Emilia's memory, all I could hear was the intimate tone he'd used with that mysterious woman. 3 weeks after that first terrible night, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. I drove to the electronics store downtown and bought a small security camera. The young clerk explained how to set it up, how to access the footage remotely through an app on my phone. My hands shook as I paid the $79.99. I felt like I was betraying Benjamin's trust, but then I reminded myself that if he had nothing to hide, the camera would only confirm his innocence. That afternoon, while Benjamin was at work, I installed the camera in Emilia's room. I hid it behind a picture frame on her dresser, angled so it would capture most of the room. My heart broke a little more with every minute I spent in that space. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. Her books on the nightstand, her jewelry box still open with her favorite earrings inside, her perfume bottle catching the afternoon light. I tested the camera feed on my phone. The image was crystal clear. Too clear. Part of me hoped the camera would malfunction, that I'd never have to see whatever Benjamin was doing in there. But I knew I had to follow through with this. I owed it to Emilia's memory. That night, I barely slept. I kept checking my phone, waiting for movement in the camera feed. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the bedroom door opened. Benjamin stepped inside, but he wasn't alone. A young woman followed him into the room. She was maybe 25, with long blonde hair and a dress that was clearly meant to come off easily. They were already kissing as they closed the door behind them. I sat up in my bed, staring at my phone screen in complete shock. This wasn't grief. This wasn't a man honoring his wife's memory. This was betrayal of the worst kind, using our daughter's sacred space as some kind of secret love nest. But what happened next was even worse than I could have imagined. As I watched in horror, Benjamin began telling the woman about Emilia. Not sharing fond memories or expressing his loss, he was using her death as part of his seduction. She would have wanted me to be happy, he told the woman as he led her to Emilia's bed. She always said I deserved love. The woman responded with sympathy and admiration for his strength in moving forward. She called him brave, said he was inspiring. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. This was a practiced routine. I watched Benjamin transform into someone I didn't recognize. Gone was the grieving widower who couldn't bear to talk about his late wife. In his place was a manipulative predator using my daughter's death to lure vulnerable women into her bed. The worst part was how comfortable he seemed. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate attempt to feel something other than grief. This was calculated, deliberate, and clearly something he'd been doing for months. As I sat there in the darkness, watching this betrayal unfold on my phone screen, I felt something shift inside me. The grief that had consumed me for 2 years began transforming into something else entirely, something harder, something more dangerous. Benjamin had no idea that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. He thought he was safe, thought he could continue using my daughter's memory and my trust to cover his sick games. But now I knew the truth, and I was going to make sure he paid for every lie, every manipulation, every moment he defiled Emilia's memory. The war had just begun, and Benjamin had no idea what was coming for him. The next morning, Benjamin sat across from me at the breakfast table, buttering his toast with the same hands that had touched another woman in Emilia's bed just hours before. He looked tired, but there was something else in his expression, a satisfied exhaustion that made my stomach turn. "Rough night?" I asked, testing him. He nodded solemnly. "I had another one of those dreams about Emily. Couldn't get back to sleep afterward. The lie rolled off his tongue so easily, so naturally, that I wondered how many others I'd swallowed over the past 2 years. Emily. He'd always called her Emily, never Emilia like the rest of us. I used to think it was just his personal nickname for her, something intimate between husband and wife. Now I realized it was probably because he could never be bothered to remember her full name properly. I spent that day in a fog of rage and disbelief. Every few hours I'd find myself replaying the camera footage in my mind, seeing Benjamin's hands on that woman, hearing him use Emilia's death as a pickup line. The violation felt almost physical, like he'd reached into my chest and crushed my heart all over again. But anger, I was learning, could be a useful emotion. It sharpened my focus, made me see things I'd been blind to before, like how Benjamin had been coming home later and later from work. How he'd started wearing cologne again, something he'd stopped doing after Emilia got sick. how he'd become secretive about his phone, always keeping it face down, stepping out of the room to take calls. I decided I needed more information before I confronted him. If Benjamin was capable of this level of deception, I had to assume there was more I didn't know. So I did something I'd never thought I'd do in my life. I started spying on my own son-in-law. The next day, I followed him after work. I felt ridiculous, like some character in a bad television show, but I had to know where he was really going during those mysterious late nights. Benjamin drove to a sports bar downtown called Murphy's. Nothing suspicious about that, except he didn't go inside alone. I watched from my car as the same blonde woman from the camera footage met him in the parking lot. They embraced like lovers who'd been apart for weeks, not hours. She was younger than I thought, probably closer to 23 or 24. Young enough to be his daughter, young enough to be Emilia's younger sister. They went inside together, and I waited in the parking lot for 3 hours until they came out. But they weren't alone. Another couple had joined them, a brunette woman about 30 and an older man I didn't recognize. The four of them stood by Benjamin's car, laughing and talking like old friends. That's when I realized the horrible truth. This wasn't just about one woman. Benjamin wasn't just cheating on my daughter's memory. He was systematically using her death to manipulate multiple women. I started taking pictures with my phone, documenting everything. License plates, faces, times, locations. If Benjamin wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I knew all the rules. Over the next week, I followed Benjamin to 3 different locations. Murphy's bar seemed to be his regular spot with the blonde. I later learned her name was Jessica from eavesdropping on their conversations. But he also met with the brunette, whose name was Maria, at a coffee shop on Elm Street. And there was a third woman, a redhead named Sarah, whom he took to dinner at an upscale restaurant across town. Each woman believed she was the only one. Each woman had been fed the same story about his tragic loss, his struggle to move on, his late wife's final wish for him to find happiness again. He tailored the details slightly for each audience, but the core manipulation remained the same. Jessica, the youngest, was apparently going through her own family tragedy. Her mother had recently been diagnosed with breast cancer. Benjamin played up the similarities between their situations, positioning himself as someone who truly understood her pain. Maria was a recent divorcee with trust issues. Benjamin presented himself as a man who'd been deeply, faithfully in love, someone who could show her that good men still existed. Sarah was a successful businesswoman in her late 30s who'd never been married. Benjamin sold her on the idea that he was a man who knew how to truly value a woman, having lost the love of his life and learned not to take anything for granted. The sick genius of it all was that each story contained just enough truth to be believable. Emilia had died young. Benjamin had been married to someone he claimed to love. But he twisted those facts into weapons, using my daughter's death as bait to lure in vulnerable women. What made it even worse was watching how these women responded to him. They genuinely cared about him, brought him comfort food when he claimed to be having bad days, listened patiently when he spun tales about missing his late wife. They were good people being manipulated by a master predator. The breaking point came when I overheard Benjamin on the phone with Jessica. I was in the kitchen when he stepped onto the back porch, thinking he was out of earshot. But the windows were open and I could hear every word. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," he told her, his voice soft and intimate, "about moving in together. I think Emily would want that for me, for us." My blood froze. Moving in together meant Jessica would be in this house, in Emilia's space, sleeping in the bed where my daughter had spent her final months. The thought of this stranger walking through rooms that still held my daughter's presence, sitting in chairs where Emilia had read her books, cooking in the kitchen where she'd made her last birthday cake, it was unbearable. But then Benjamin said something that nearly knocked me to my knees. "I've been talking to my father-in-law about it," he continued. "Frank's getting older, and honestly, I think it would be better for everyone if he moved into one of those senior communities." This house is too big for him anyway, and the memories are probably painful. He was planning to get rid of me. After using my grief and trust for 2 years, after violating my daughter's memory in the most disgusting way possible, he wanted to ship me off to some nursing home so he could turn our family home into his personal hunting ground. I stood there in my own kitchen, listening to this man discuss disposing of me like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture, and I felt something inside me snap. The last vestiges of the broken father-in-law who'd been grateful for Benjamin's companionship died in that moment. That night, I installed a second camera in the living room and a third in the hallway. If Benjamin thought he could manipulate me the way he'd manipulated those women, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I also did something else. I created fake profiles on 3 different dating apps using pictures of myself from 20 years ago. It took me all night to figure out the technology. I'm not exactly computer savvy, but I was determined to understand how Benjamin was finding these women. Within hours, I had matches. Within days, I was chatting with lonely women who were looking for connection, for love, for someone who understood their pain. And that's when I truly understood the scope of Benjamin's predatory behavior. He wasn't just targeting random women. He was specifically seeking out the vulnerable ones, the grieving, the divorced, the lonely. Women who were emotionally fragile enough to fall for his manipulative stories. But Benjamin had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the man he was trying to deceive. He saw a grieving father-in-law and assumed I'd be easy to control, easy to discard when I was no longer useful. He had no idea that beneath my grief was a man who'd spent 30 years in construction management, who knew how to plan, how to execute, and how to tear down structures that weren't built on solid foundations. Benjamin's house of lies was about to come crashing down around him, and I was going to make sure he understood exactly who was responsible for every piece of rubble. 3 weeks into my investigation, I thought I'd seen the worst of Benjamin's deception. I was wrong. The man living in my house, eating my food, pretending to grieve my daughter wasn't just a cheater or a liar. He was something far more dangerous. It started when I decided to dig deeper into his past. If Benjamin was this good at manipulation, this comfortable with deception, it couldn't have started with Emilia's death. People don't just wake up one day and become master predators. They practice. They refine their skills. They leave a trail. I spent an entire Saturday at the public library, using their computers to search for information about Benjamin's previous relationships. What I found made my hands shake so violently I had to step outside for fresh air. Benjamin had been married before, not once but twice. Both wives had died young. Both had left him substantial life insurance payouts. Both deaths had been ruled natural, but the timing was suspicious enough that I felt sick to my stomach. His first wife, Margaret, had died of complications from pneumonia at age 28. She'd been healthy, active, with no history of respiratory problems. But according to the obituary, she'd fallen ill suddenly and deteriorated rapidly. Benjamin had been her sole caregiver during her final weeks. His second wife, Linda, had died in a car accident at 31. Single car crash, late at night, after leaving what witnesses described as a heated argument with Benjamin at a restaurant. The police report mentioned that she'd been drinking, but friends quoted in local news articles insisted Linda never drank and drove, ever. Then there was my Emilia, 32 years old. Cancer that seemed to progress faster than her doctors expected. Benjamin insisting on handling all her medications, all her appointments, all her care decisions. I sat in that library parking lot for an hour, trying to process what I'd learned. 3 wives, 3 young deaths, 3 substantial insurance payouts. The pattern was so obvious now that I couldn't believe I'd missed it. But the worst discovery was yet to come. That evening, while Benjamin was out with Jessica, I decided to search his room. I told myself I was looking for evidence of his affairs, but deep down, I think I was looking for proof that I was wrong about the insurance money, wrong about the pattern, wrong about everything. I found his laptop hidden in the back of his closet behind a stack of boxes marked Emily's things, boxes I'd never seen him actually pack or organize. The laptop wasn't password protected, which should have been my first warning that Benjamin wasn't as careful as he thought he was. His browser history was a nightmare. Dating sites, forums about widower support groups, articles about how to appear grief-stricken. But the worst part was a folder labeled Resources that contained detailed psychological profiles he'd compiled on vulnerable women. Benjamin hadn't been randomly meeting these women. He'd been hunting them. He had files on dozens of women containing their emotional triggers, their financial situations, their family backgrounds, their vulnerabilities. Jessica's file noted her mother's cancer diagnosis and her substantial inheritance from her grandmother. Maria's file detailed her recent divorce settlement and her trust issues. Sarah's file documented her successful business and her desperation to find someone before her biological clock ran out. Each file read like a predator's manual. Benjamin had mapped out exactly how to approach each woman. What emotional buttons to push. What stories to tell. He'd even practiced different versions of his tragic widower routine, adjusting the details based on what each woman would find most compelling. But it was the folder labeled long-term planning that made me understand just how deep his deception ran. Benjamin had been planning to leave me and sell the house for months. He'd already contacted several real estate agents for unofficial valuations. The house, my house, where I'd raised Emilia, where she'd taken her first steps and said her first words, was worth approximately $450,000. His plan was elegant in its cruelty. He would convince one of his women to move in with him, then gradually make my life uncomfortable enough that I'd agree to move into a senior living facility. Once I was gone, he'd claim the house needed too many repairs for an elderly man to handle and convince me to sign it over to him to sell. After all, who would I leave it to anyway? He was my only family now. The money from the sale would fund his new life with whichever woman proved most profitable. If that relationship didn't work out, well, he'd had practice starting over before. I found detailed financial projections showing how he planned to maximize his return on what he called his investment in each relationship. Jessica was young and had money, but she was also naive and might require a longer-term commitment. Maria was emotionally damaged enough to be easily controlled, but her divorce settlement wasn't as substantial as he'd initially hoped. Sarah had the most money, but was also the most independent and might be harder to manipulate long-term. He was treating these women like business opportunities, weighing their emotional vulnerabilities against their financial assets to determine which one would give him the best return on his time and effort. The most horrifying document was titled Exit Strategies. Benjamin had planned out how to end each relationship if it became inconvenient, including scenarios that involved making the women believe they were the problem, that they weren't ready for love after all. But the document that made me physically ill was labeled Insurance Considerations. Benjamin had researched the life insurance policies of all three women. He knew Jessica had a policy worth $200,000 through her job. Maria had a smaller policy, but she was also the most emotionally unstable and therefore, according to his notes, the most likely to harm herself if the relationship ended badly. Sarah had the largest policy, $500,000, but she was also the most suspicious and would require careful handling. I stared at those documents until my eyes burned. This wasn't just about money or sex or manipulation. Benjamin was evaluating these women as potential victims. He was planning their deaths. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Emilia hadn't died of cancer. She'd been murdered. Slowly, methodically, carefully, but murdered nonetheless. And I'd helped him do it. I remembered how insistent Benjamin had been about handling her medications, how he'd convinced her to switch doctors when her first oncologist wanted to try a more aggressive treatment. How he'd isolated her from her friends, claiming they were too negative during her recovery. How he'd encouraged her to update her will and life insurance beneficiaries just in case. I'd thought he was being a devoted husband. In reality, he'd been preparing for her death. The worst part was that Emilia had trusted him completely. She died believing she was loved, believing her husband was sacrificing everything to care for her. She'd never known that the man holding her hand during chemotherapy was the same man who was slowly poisoning her chances of survival. I sat there in Benjamin's room, surrounded by evidence of his calculated evil, and felt something fundamental break inside me. The grief I'd carried for 2 years transformed into something harder, colder, more dangerous. Benjamin thought he was smart. He thought he'd covered his tracks, manipulated the right people, planned the perfect crimes. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated a father's love. I carefully photographed every document, every file, every piece of evidence. Then I closed the laptop and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Benjamin couldn't know that I'd discovered his secrets. Not yet. Because I was going to make sure that this time he was the one who didn't see the end coming. The next morning, Benjamin sat across from me at breakfast, reading the newspaper and commenting on the weather. He looked so normal, so ordinary. No one would have guessed that they were sharing coffee with a man who'd murdered 3 wives and was actively planning to murder again. "Frank," he said, looking up from his paper, "I've been thinking we should talk about the future, about what's best for both of us." I took a slow sip of my coffee, meeting his eyes over the rim of my cup. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, I know this house holds a lot of memories for you, but it's also a lot of work for a man your age. I've been looking into some really nice retirement communities, places where you could make friends, have activities, not worry about maintenance and upkeep." The audacity of it took my breath away. He was sitting there, planning my disposal, while I knew exactly what he'd done to my daughter. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said calmly, "but I think I'd like to stay here a while longer. This is where I feel closest to Emilia." Something flickered across Benjamin's face, annoyance, maybe even anger, before he smiled again. "Of course, Frank, I understand. We don't have to decide anything right away." But his tone said otherwise. His tone said that whether I agreed or not, I was going to be leaving this house soon. Benjamin had no idea that I'd already started planning his exit strategy. And unlike his carefully calculated murders, my plan was going to be loud, public, and absolutely devastating. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Benjamin was at work. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and I'd grown suspicious of unexpected contacts. But something made me pick up on the 4th ring. "Is this Frank Morrison?" The voice was female, nervous, young. "Yes, who's asking?" "My name is Rebecca Chen. I think we need to talk about Benjamin." My blood went cold. This wasn't one of his 3 current targets. This was someone new, someone I didn't know about. "What about Benjamin?" There was a long pause, then the sound of crying. "I think he killed my sister." We met that afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. Rebecca was 26, a nurse at the county hospital. Her sister Amy had been Benjamin's girlfriend 3 years ago, right before he met Emilia. Amy had died of what the coroner ruled was an accidental overdose of prescription medication. "Amy never did drugs," Rebecca told me, her hand shaking as she held her coffee cup. "She barely took aspirin for headaches. But Benjamin convinced everyone that she'd been depressed, that she'd been taking pills to cope with stress." The story was sickeningly familiar. Benjamin had isolated Amy from her family, claiming they didn't understand their relationship. He'd convinced her to change doctors, to try new medications for anxiety she'd never had before. He'd been with her the night she died, claimed he'd tried to save her, but it was too late. "The insurance company paid out," Rebecca continued, $50,000. Not much compared to what he probably gets from others, but Amy was young, she didn't have much. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Preserve the original language of the text and showed me a dating app profile. Benjamin's face smiled back at me, but the name was different. Ben Morrison. He was using my last name, claiming to be recently widowed, looking for someone who understood loss. I've been tracking him for 2 years," she said, "ever since I figured out what really happened to Amy. I know about Margaret and Linda. I know about your daughter. And I know about the 3 women he's seeing now." My hands clenched into fists. "You've known about this for 2 years and never said anything?" "I tried," she said, her voice breaking. "I went to the police, but they said there wasn't enough evidence. All the deaths were ruled natural or accidental. Benjamin's smart. He never leaves proof. I hired a private investigator with my own money, but even he couldn't find anything that would hold up in court. So what changed?" Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I've been watching him, documenting everything. And I think he's planning something big. Something that involves multiple targets at once." She pulled out a folder thick with photographs, printed emails, and handwritten notes. "Benjamin's been telling each of his current women that he's ready to take the next step. Jessica thinks he's going to propose. Maria believes he's going to ask her to move in. Sarah thinks he's planning some kind of romantic getaway." I stared at the evidence she'd compiled. It was more thorough than anything I'd managed to gather. "How did you get all this?" "I've been posing as different people online, joining the same support groups he trolls for victims. I've been following him, photographing his meetings, recording conversations when I could. I've made myself into his shadow." The scope of her investigation was staggering. Rebecca had documented dozens of women Benjamin had contacted over the past 2 years. Most conversations never progressed beyond initial contact, but several had developed into short-term relationships that ended abruptly when the women either became suspicious or ran out of money. "He's getting more aggressive," she explained, "more reckless. I think the insurance money from your daughter is running out and he needs a bigger score." That's when she showed me the document that made my heart stop. Benjamin had created a detailed plan for something he called the weekend. He was planning to take all 3 of his current targets on what each woman believed was an exclusive romantic getaway to a cabin in the mountains. Each woman had been told that Benjamin had rented the cabin to process his grief, to finally let go of his late wife's memory and move forward with their relationship. Each woman believed she would be the only one there. Each woman had been convinced to tell their families they were going away for a few days to figure things out. But Benjamin had only rented the cabin for 1 weekend. And according to his notes, only 1 woman would be coming back. "He's planning to kill 2 of them and marry the survivor," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. "The perfect grieving widower who loses 2 dear friends in a tragic accident but finds the strength to move forward with the woman who helped him through his darkest time." The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. A gas leak maybe, or a carbon monoxide incident. 2 tragic deaths, 1 survivor who would be so traumatized and grateful for Benjamin's support that she'd never question anything. The insurance payouts from the 2 dead women, combined with the emotional manipulation of the survivor, would set Benjamin up for years. "When?" I asked. "This weekend, 3 days from now." I felt the world spinning around me. 3 innocent women were going to die because I'd been too blind to see what Benjamin really was. Too trusting, too grateful for his presence in my grief to notice that he was a predator who'd murdered my daughter. "We have to stop him," I said. "How?" Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "I've been trying to stop him for 2 years. The police won't listen. I have no legal standing. These women think I'm crazy when I try to warn them. Benjamin's already told them that Amy's sister is unstable, that she's been harassing him since the accident." But Rebecca had underestimated something crucial. She'd been fighting Benjamin alone, from the outside, trying to convince strangers that someone they trusted was dangerous. I had something she didn't have. I had access. That night, I waited until Benjamin was in Emilia's room with Jessica. I'd learned to predict his schedule with sickening accuracy. Then I went into his bedroom and accessed his laptop again. But this time, I wasn't just gathering evidence. I was going to war. I spent 4 hours systematically destroying Benjamin's carefully constructed web of lies. I sent messages from his accounts to each of his 3 targets, arranging for them to meet him at the same restaurant at the same time on Thursday night. I made each woman believe they were finally going to meet Benjamin's family, that he was ready to introduce them to the people who mattered most in his life. I also did something else. I created a group email containing all the evidence Rebecca and I had gathered, the insurance records, the pattern of deaths, the detailed files Benjamin kept on his targets, everything. The email was addressed to the 3 women, but it was scheduled to send automatically at 6 p.m. on Thursday, right around the time they would all be sitting together, realizing they'd been played. But my masterpiece was the video I recorded on Benjamin's own laptop, using his own camera. I sat in his chair, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, and told the whole story. I explained who I was, what Benjamin had done to my daughter, what he was planning to do to them. I included photos of Margaret, Linda, Amy, and Emilia. I showed them the insurance documents, the planning files, everything. The video was attached to the same scheduled email. But I wasn't done. I also sent copies of everything to Rebecca, to the local police, to the FBI's white-collar crime division, and to an investigative journalist at the local newspaper who'd written about insurance fraud in the past. Benjamin thought he was smart, thought he could manipulate everyone around him indefinitely. But he'd forgotten that even the most elaborate house of cards could be brought down by one person who knew exactly where to push. Thursday evening, I sat in my living room, waiting. At exactly 6:15, my phone started ringing. Benjamin's panicked voice filled the room when I answered. "Frank, there's been some kind of mistake. Some crazy woman is here claiming to be my girlfriend. And Jessica's here too, and they're both saying." I hung up on him. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time it was Jessica, crying and confused. "Mr. Morrison, I don't understand what's happening. Benjamin's here with another woman, and they're both saying they're in relationships with him, and someone sent me this email with all these horrible things." "Read the email, Jessica," I said calmly. "Read it carefully, and then ask Benjamin about Margaret, Linda, Amy, and my daughter Emilia." The third call came from Maria, then Sarah, then Rebecca, who was apparently at the restaurant watching the confrontation unfold from across the room. "It's chaos," she reported. "Benjamin's trying to talk his way out of it, but they're not buying it. Jessica's showing the other women the emails. Sarah's taking pictures. Maria's on the phone with someone, maybe the police." I smiled for the first time in 2 years. Benjamin's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, in public, with witnesses, and no way to charm his way out of it. But the best part was yet to come, because while Benjamin was dealing with his exposed affairs and ruined reputation, I still had one more card to play, and this one was going to hurt him where it mattered most, his freedom. Benjamin came home that night like a wounded animal, slamming doors and pacing through the house with the frantic energy of a man whose carefully constructed world had just exploded. I was sitting in my recliner, reading a book as if nothing had happened, when he burst into the living room. "What did you do?" His face was flushed, his hair disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled from what I assumed had been a very uncomfortable evening. I looked up from my book slowly, meeting his eyes with the calm expression I'd been practicing for weeks. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't play games with me." "Frank?" His voice was shaking with rage. "Someone sent those women emails with private information, personal things that only someone with access to my computer could have known." "That sounds serious," I said, turning a page. "Have you considered calling the police?" The question hit him like a slap. We both knew he couldn't call the police, not when those emails contained evidence of insurance fraud, psychological manipulation, and quite possibly murder. Benjamin's jaw clenched as he realized the trap he was in. "Those women are making wild accusations," he said, trying a different approach, "claiming I was dating all of them at the same time. It's insane. They're obviously unstable, probably jealous of each other." I set my book down and looked at him with the kind of pity you'd show a child caught in an obvious lie. "Benjamin, I've seen the camera footage." The color drained from his face. For a moment, he just stood there, opening and closing his mouth like a fish pulled from water. Then the mask slipped completely, and I saw him for what he really was, a predator backed into a corner. "You've been spying on me?" The accusation came out as a whisper. "I've been protecting my daughter's memory," I corrected, something I should have done 2 years ago. Benjamin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You have no idea what you've done. Those women trusted me. I was helping them heal, giving them comfort after their losses." The audacity of it almost made me laugh. Even now, caught red-handed, he was still trying to spin his predatory behavior as some kind of charitable work. "Is that what you told yourself when you killed Margaret?" I asked quietly. "That you were helping her?" Benjamin went completely still. The silence stretched between us like a loaded gun. "What about Linda?" I continued. "Was driving her to suicide helping her too?" "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. I stood up slowly, my old joints protesting, and walked to the mantel where I kept a framed photo of Emilia from her college graduation. She was smiling, radiant with hope for the future she'd never get to live. "Tell me about Amy Chen," I said without turning around. This time, Benjamin's sharp intake of breath was audible. I'd surprised him. He thought Amy was a secret, a loose end that had been neatly tied up and forgotten. "I don't know who that is," he lied. I turned to face him, still holding Emilia's picture. "Rebecca Chen's sister, 24 years old, died of an overdose of medication she never took, prescribed by a doctor you convinced her to see. $50,000 insurance payout." Benjamin's face had gone gray. "You're insane. You're making connections that don't exist." "Am I?" I walked over to the coffee table and picked up a manila folder I'd prepared earlier. "Because I have insurance records for all of them. Margaret, Linda, Amy, and my Emilia. 4 young women, 4 convenient deaths, 4 substantial payouts, all to the same beneficiary." I opened the folder and began reading from the documents inside. Margaret Hartwell, died February 14, 2016. Cause of death, complications from pneumonia. Beneficiary, Benjamin Hartwell, husband. Payout, $125,000. Benjamin's breathing was becoming labored. "Those are private records. You had no right." Linda Morrison, I continued, ignoring his protests, died August 3, 2018. Cause of death, single car accident. Beneficiary, Benjamin Morrison, husband. Payout, $200,000. "Stop," Benjamin said, but his voice was barely audible. Amy Chen, died November 21, 2020. Cause of death, accidental overdose. Beneficiary, Benjamin Chen, boyfriend and emergency contact. Payout, $50,000. I looked up at him, watching as the weight of his exposed crimes pressed down on his shoulders. "And then there's my Emilia, Emilia Morrison, died January 15, 2022. Cause of death, complications from cancer treatment. Beneficiary, Benjamin Morrison, husband. Payout, $350,000. The math was simple. Over 6 years, Benjamin had collected $725,000 from the deaths of 4 young women. He'd been running a systematic murder operation, and I'd handed him my daughter on a silver platter. "You're sick," Benjamin said, but there was no fight left in him. "These are coincidences, tragic coincidences." Really? I pulled out another document. Because I also have your browser history, Benjamin. Articles about untraceable poisons. Forums about how to induce heart attacks. Research on medication interactions that could cause fatal complications. Benjamin collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He looked like a broken man, defeated and lost. Then I remembered Emilia's final weeks, how she trusted him completely while he slowly murdered her, and the pity evaporated. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You're going to pack your things and leave this house tonight. You're never going to contact me again, never going to come back here, never going to set foot on this property." Benjamin looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. He thought I was offering him an escape, a chance to disappear and start over somewhere else with a new identity and new victims. "And then," I continued, "you're going to turn yourself in to the police." The hope died instantly. "Frank, please, think about what you're doing. If you destroy me, you destroy Emilia's memory too. People will know she was married to a murderer. Is that what you want?" It was his final manipulation. His last desperate attempt to use my love for my daughter against me. But he'd miscalculated badly. "Emilia's memory doesn't need protection from the truth," I said. "She was a victim, not an accomplice. People will remember her as a young woman who trusted the wrong man, not as someone who chose to marry a killer." Benjamin tried one more approach. "What about the money, the insurance money? If I go to prison, you'll never see any of it. But if we work together, if we find a way to make this go away, I could share it with you. Consider it payment for all the help you've given me." The offer was so obscene, so fundamentally evil, that I actually laughed. "You think I want blood money? You think I want a single penny that came from murdering my daughter?" I walked over to where Benjamin sat slumped in defeat and leaned down so we were eye to eye. "That money is evidence, Benjamin. Every dollar you spent, every check you deposited, every luxury you bought with my daughter's life, it's all evidence that's going to help put you in prison for the rest of your miserable existence. Frank, please, get out of my house," I said quietly. "Pack your things and leave now." Benjamin looked around the living room like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in the family photos, the comfortable furniture, the home he'd planned to steal from me. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care," I said, "but if you're not gone in 1 hour, I'm calling the police myself." He stood up slowly, looking older than his 41 years. "You know I'll run, right? I'll disappear, change my name, start over somewhere else. You'll never see justice for Emilia." I smiled, and there must have been something cold in that expression because Benjamin actually took a step back. "No, Benjamin," I said softly, "you won't run, because while you were dealing with angry girlfriends tonight, I was making some phone calls of my own." His face went white. "What calls?" "The FBI, for starters. Turns out they're very interested in patterns of insurance fraud involving multiple suspicious deaths. They're also interested in a certain laptop containing detailed psychological profiles of potential victims." Benjamin's knees gave out, and he sank back into the chair. "I also called Rebecca Chen," I continued. "She's been documenting your activities for 2 years, waiting for someone with enough evidence to make a case stick. Guess what? She doesn't have to wait anymore." "And then there's my personal favorite," I said, pulling out my phone. "I called Jessica's father. Turns out he's a retired police detective who specializes in cold cases. He's very interested in reopening the investigations into Margaret, Linda, and Amy's deaths." Benjamin's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. He was having a panic attack, realizing that all his escape routes had been cut off while he wasn't looking. "You see, Benjamin, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that everyone around you was as weak and gullible as your victims. You thought you could manipulate me the same way you manipulated them. But I'm not a grieving young woman looking for love. I'm a father who just learned that his daughter was murdered. I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. And fathers like me don't forgive. We don't forget. And we sure as hell don't let our children's killers walk away. Benjamin was crying now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. Please, Frank, I'll do whatever you want. I'll pay you money. I'll leave town. I'll never bother anyone again. You're right, I said, straightening up. You'll never bother anyone again, because you're going to spend the rest of your life in a prison cell thinking about what you did to 4 innocent women. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. Cool night air rushed into the house, carrying with it the promise of justice finally served. 1 hour. Benjamin, I called over my shoulder. After that, this becomes a crime scene, and you become a fugitive. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear Benjamin behind me, frantically making phone calls, probably trying to reach lawyers or call in favors or find some way to escape the consequences of his actions. But it was too late for all of that. The web of lies he'd spent years weaving had finally collapsed, and there was no way out. Tomorrow, the healing could finally begin. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching Benjamin being led away in handcuffs. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 4 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of insurance fraud. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of a very long, very painful chapter. The case had made national headlines. The grieving widower killer, the media called him a monster hiding in plain sight. The story had everything journalists loved: multiple victims, insurance money, psychological manipulation, and a grieving father's quest for justice. But for me, it wasn't about the headlines or the media attention or even the satisfaction of seeing Benjamin pay for his crimes. It was about Emilia finally being able to rest in peace. Rebecca Chen had become an unlikely friend during the investigation and trial. She testified as a key witness, her 2 years of meticulous documentation providing crucial evidence that linked Benjamin to Amy's death. After the sentencing, she found me in the courthouse hallway. "It's really over," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," I agreed, "it's over." We stood there in comfortable silence. 2 people who'd been carrying the weight of terrible knowledge for too long, finally able to set that burden down. "What will you do now?" she asked. I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. The house felt different now that Benjamin was gone. The shadows he'd cast over every room had lifted, but they'd been replaced by a different kind of emptiness. Not the crushing grief of loss, but the hollow feeling that comes after a long battle finally ends. "I think I'm going to sell the house," I said. Rebecca looked surprised. "I thought you wanted to stay close to Emilia's memory." "I do," I said, "but I'm realizing that Emilia's memory isn't trapped in that house. It's in here," I tapped my chest, "and I can carry it with me wherever I go." The truth was, the house had been tainted by Benjamin's presence. Every room held memories of his deception, his manipulation, his crimes. Emilia's bedroom, in particular, would always be the place where I'd discovered the depths of his betrayal. I couldn't heal there. I couldn't move forward while surrounded by reminders of how blind I'd been. 3 weeks after the trial ended, I put the house on the market. It sold in 4 days for asking price, $468,000, more than enough to start over somewhere new. But before I left, I had one final task to complete. I drove to Peaceful Garden Cemetery on a sunny Tuesday morning in late September. I'd avoided visiting Emilia's grave during the investigation and trial. It had felt wrong to stand there with so many unanswered questions, so much unfinished business. But now, with Benjamin behind bars and the truth finally exposed, I was ready to say goodbye properly. The headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Daughter." Benjamin had chosen those words, and I'd been too grief-stricken to object at the time. Now I wished I'd insisted on something more personal, more reflective of who Emilia really was. I knelt beside the grave and placed a bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, on the freshly trimmed grass. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said aloud, my voice carrying across the empty cemetery. "I'm sorry I didn't see what he was doing to you. I'm sorry I let him fool me for so long. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I could almost hear her voice responding. Not the weak, sick voice from her final months, but the strong, vibrant voice of the daughter I'd raised. The daughter who'd always been able to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. "But I want you to know that justice has been served," I continued. "Benjamin will never hurt anyone else the way he hurt you. He'll spend the rest of his life paying for what he did." I stayed there for an hour, talking to her about the investigation, the trial, the other women Benjamin had killed. I told her about Rebecca, about Jessica and Maria and Sarah, about how her death had ultimately saved other lives by exposing Benjamin's pattern. When I finally stood to leave, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because the pain of losing her was gone, that would never fully heal, but because I'd finally done right by her memory. I moved to a small coastal town in North Carolina, about 3 hours from where Emilia was buried. Close enough to visit her grave regularly, far enough to start fresh. I bought a modest house with a view of the ocean and began the slow process of rebuilding my life. The insurance money from Benjamin's conviction, all $725,000, went to a victims' rights organization that helped families navigate the legal system after violent crimes. I didn't want a penny of it. That money represented too much pain, too much lost potential, too many dreams cut short. But I kept one thing from the settlement: a fund that paid for grief counseling for the families of Benjamin's victims. Margaret's elderly parents, Linda's teenage son, Amy's sister Rebecca, and eventually other families who would face similar losses. It felt like a way to honor not just Emilia, but all the women whose lives Benjamin had stolen. A year after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Jessica, the young blonde woman I'd seen in those horrible camera recordings, knocked on my door on a rainy Thursday afternoon. She was different from the naive girl I remembered from Benjamin's files. Older, more serious, with the kind of careful composure that comes from surviving trauma. "Mr. Morrison," she said when I opened the door, "I hope you don't mind me coming by. I got your address from Rebecca." I invited her in, made coffee, and waited for her to explain why she'd driven 3 hours to see me. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, "for saving my life." "You don't need to thank me for that." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm. "I've been in therapy for the past year, working through what happened with Benjamin. My counselor helped me understand how close I came to joining your daughter." She pulled out a folder and set it on my kitchen table. "I found these in my apartment after Benjamin was arrested. He'd been leaving them there during his visits, probably planning to use them later." Inside the folder were medical brochures about depression and anxiety, pamphlets about medication interactions, and printouts of articles about young women who died from accidental overdoses. Benjamin had been laying the groundwork for Jessica's murder, creating a paper trail that would support a narrative of suicide or accidental death. "The police think he was planning to kill me within the next few months," she said. "Maybe around the holidays, when people are more likely to believe someone might be depressed." I stared at the documents, feeling sick all over again. Benjamin's planning had been even more meticulous than I'd realized. "But you stopped him," Jessica continued. "You saved not just me, but Maria and Sarah too. We all could have ended up like your daughter." "Emilia would be proud of that," I said, and meant it. We talked for another hour about healing, about moving forward, about finding meaning in survival. When Jessica finally left, she hugged me goodbye, a gesture that would have been impossible for either of us a year earlier, when we were both trapped in Benjamin's web of deception. 2 years after Benjamin's conviction, I received a letter from him in prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 3 pages of self-pity and manipulation. Benjamin claimed he'd found God in prison, that he was sorry for his actions, that he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive him. He talked about the difficult childhood that had shaped him, the pressures that had driven him to desperate measures, the mental illness that had clouded his judgment. It was all lies, of course. One final attempt to manipulate someone who'd seen through his facade. Benjamin wasn't sorry. He was just sorry he'd been caught. I wrote back, not because I believed his claims of remorse, but because I had something to say that I'd been waiting 2 years to communicate. Benjamin, I wrote, I want you to know that your victims are remembered with love, while you will be forgotten completely. Margaret, Linda, Amy, and Emilia lived full, meaningful lives in the time they had. They were loved by their families, cherished by their friends, and mourned by people who knew their true worth. You, on the other hand, will spend the rest of your life in a cell, surrounded by people who know exactly what you are. No one will visit you. No one will write to you after this. No one will remember your name after you die, except as a footnote in the stories of the women whose lives actually mattered. That is justice. Not just your punishment, but your irrelevance. I never heard from him again. 3 years after the trial, I met Catherine at a grief support group for parents who'd lost adult children. She'd lost her son in a car accident 2 years earlier, and like me, she was learning to build a new life around the hole that loss had left behind. Our relationship developed slowly, carefully. Both of us were wary of trusting again, both scarred by different kinds of betrayal. But we found comfort in each other's company, peace in sharing our stories without judgment or the pressure to move on before we were ready. 6 months ago, we got married in a small ceremony on the beach near my house. Rebecca was there, along with Jessica, Maria, and Sarah, the women whose lives had been saved by exposing Benjamin's crimes. It felt fitting that they should be part of this new beginning, this proof that healing was possible, even after the worst kind of betrayal. Catherine understands that I will always love Emilia, will always carry the pain of losing her. Just as I understand that she will always mourn her son David. We don't try to replace what we've lost. Instead, we've learned to honor our grief while still choosing to live. This morning, Catherine and I visited Emilia's grave together. I told my daughter about my new wife, about the life I'm building, about the peace I've finally found. Catherine placed her own flowers beside mine, white roses, a symbol of remembrance and new beginnings. As we walked back to the car, Catherine took my hand. "Do you think she would approve?" she asked. I looked back at the headstone one more time, thinking about the vibrant, loving young woman I'd raised, the daughter who'd always wanted nothing more than for the people she loved to be happy. "Yes," I said, "I think she'd be glad I'm not alone anymore." And for the first time since Benjamin entered our lives, I truly believed that everything was going to be okay. The monsters of this world count on our silence, our shame, our willingness to protect them in the name of keeping peace. But sometimes, the greatest act of love is refusing to stay quiet when someone we cherish has been wronged. Emilia's death taught me that grief can be a powerful force for justice, and that a father's love doesn't end when his child's life does. It transforms, becomes something fierce and protective and absolutely unbreakable. Benjamin thought he could manipulate me the way he'd manipulated so many others. He thought my grief made me weak, made me vulnerable to his lies. He learned too late that grief can also make you fearless. I hope my story serves as a warning to predators like Benjamin. You may think you're clever, you may think you're untouchable, but there will always be someone who loves your victims more than you could ever imagine. And that love will hunt you down, expose you, and make sure you face the consequences of your crimes. Justice may be slow, but it is relentless. And sometimes, it wears the face of a grieving father who refuses to let his daughter's killer walk free.